The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm very happy to welcome you all to the first EVPA webinar of the year. Today's topic, as you can see, will be about how EuSEF recent reform can impact the venture philanthropy and social investment sector. My name is Matteo Mascolo. I'm the new Public Affairs Manager at the European Venture Philanthropy Association, and I will be moderating the webinar. Before we dive into the topic of today's webinar, let me walk you through some technical aspects. Throughout this session, you will be able to open or hide the control panel, which is the console that appears on the right-hand side of your screen. Please note that the control panel automatically collapses when it's not being used, but you can keep it visible via the view menu on the top. In the Join Audio section of the control panel, you should tick the option Microphone and Speakers if you're joining the webinar through Internet. If you're using the telephone rather than the VoIP, you must choose telephone and use the PIN code provided in the confirmation you received when you register for this webinar. You can also see the PIN on this slide. If you happen to have any technical issues, please don't hesitate to call EVPA and get in touch with my colleague Gianluca Gaggiotti, and you can find his number on this slide. Given the high level of participation to today's session, we are actually over 100 people who registered. We will be keeping the participants to the webinar muted in order to avoid noise interferences, but we really encourage you all to raise any question you might have. If you do have a question, please write it in the question section of the control panel at any point during the webinar. Please do not forget to clearly mention to whom you would like to address it. The last part of today's webinar will consist of an interactive Q&A session during which we will address your questions to the panelists. If for some reason your question has not been answered during the webinar, feel free to contact us via email afterwards and we will ensure the necessary follow-up. You can also use that question section to let us know about any technical problems you experience. Last but not least, note that this session is being recorded, so you will be able to watch the recording and consult the presentation as of next week on EVPA's website. Now that these housekeeping details are clear, let me give you a quick word about the European Venture Philanthropy Association. EVPA is a membership organization currently gathering more than 220 members from all across Europe who are interested in or practicing venture philanthropy and social investments. Our members include foundations, social investors, academics, financial institutions, as well as service providers. Our policy and public affairs work relies on two pillars. First, in our role as a thought leader, we act as a counterpart for the institutions of the EU by being the voice of the sector, communicating the concern and expectation of our members to European policymakers. Doing so, we lead the discussion and shape the debate. We also spot and discuss key topics of interest to our sectors, including relevant initiatives undertaken by the EU. Second, in our role as a catalyst, we bring together different actors together in conversation and collaboration in order to increase mutual understanding, shared value, and impact. We carry out initiatives that tap into the synergies between the public and the private sector and showcase best policy practices and inspirational success stories from our sector. We thus aim to inform, initiate interaction, and also inspire. Let me now speak about the EU webinar series. The EU webinar series is a project we started in 2014 and through which we could reach more than 1,000 people. This series connects policymakers and practitioners in the venture philanthropy and social investment sector around topics of interest with a policy angle. As you can see, we have already addressed issues such as social impact bonds, public procurement, retail impact investing, or crowdfunding. If you're interested in these topics, all recordings and presentations are available on our website. At the end of the webinar, a short survey will pop up on your screen. We would greatly appreciate if you could take 2 minutes to fill this in. It's also an opportunity to let us know about a specific policy topic you would like us to address in our EU webinar series. So don't hesitate to grab it. Now, Let me explain why we have decided to focus on today's topic, so on how recent reform can impact the venture philanthropy and social investment sector, and what we want to accomplish during this webinar. First, the EuSEF regulation is part of the investment plan for Europe and is therefore part of the Commission's drive to stimulate venture capital investments in the EU. The regulation was not due for general reviews until July 2017. However, given that its results were not satisfactory, the Commission decided to anticipate the review. This led to the reform we will be discussing today. The reform in question came into force on the 1st March of this year, meaning 1 month ago. There is therefore no better time to discuss the reform and its impact on the venture philanthropy and social investment sector. Secondly, about what we want to accomplish. By the end of the webinar, all the participants will have a clear overview of what EuSEF is, understand why the Commission decided to reform the regulation, have an idea of the most important legal aspect of the regulation, gain a practical perspective of the EuSEF designation. Hopefully, at the end of the webinar, you will have an idea whether the EuSEF reform was successful or not, and whether or not EuSEF is a useful tool that makes it easier for investors to invest and identify funds specialized in social enterprises, and for social enterprises to attract investments. Now, let me walk you through our today's agenda. As you can see, today we will have 3 presentations. Giovanni Garcia from the European Commission, DG FISMA, will give us an overview of the EuSEF regulation and will explain us the recent reform. Roberto Landazzo, a lawyer with expertise in social entrepreneurship and also new president-elect of ESELA, the European Social Enterprises Law Association, will address some legal technicalities of the regulation and will also illustrate a case study. Finally, Olivier Deguerre, chairman of FeeTrust, one of the few EuSEF funds in place, will explain the perspective of fund manager, outlining the challenges and the opportunities of the EuSEF regulation. You can see in this slide our speakers, and our speakers will go through their presentation one after the other. There will be a question and answer session at the end of their presentations, when we will all have the chance to dive deeper into some of the issues by addressing them, all of your questions. So please don't hesitate to write your questions in the question panel when they arise, so we can ask them during the final part of the webinar. Please do not forget to mention to whom you would like to address your question. And with all these outstanding premises, I leave the floor to our first speaker, Mr. Giovanni Garcia, Policy Officer at the European Commission, DG FISMA, in charge of EuSEF and also EuVECA regulation. He will give us an overview of the EuSEF regulation, and he will also explain us its recent reform. Please, Giovanni, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much, Matteo and the EVPA, for inviting me and giving me the opportunity to speak about the recent review of the European Social Entrepreneurship Funds regulation. As you mentioned before, I will give a general background to give you a bit of a policy background, why the regulation were set up in first place, and why we came up with the review. And then I will go a bit more into the details, again, on still at the general level, on the major changes we undertook in the review. So, as you mentioned before, one of the top priority of this commission is jobs and growth. So you may have heard this many times from our President Juncker, and you may be familiar also with the investment plan for Europe, the so-called Juncker plan, which has 3 pillars. And the third pillar is what referred to, let's say, stimulate and simplify the legal environment to boost jobs and growth. In this third pillar, it fits what we refer as our flagship initiative, which is the Capital Markets Union, which is basically to boost non-bank financing to the real economy. We under no means want to affect bank financing. On the contrary, what we want is to stimulate alternative and complementary form of financing for the real economy, and in particular for SMEs. The two regulations, I mean, I always refer to the two regulations because in 2013, when they've been adopted in parallel, the European Venture Capital Funds, EuVECA, and the European Social Entrepreneurship Funds, EuSEF regulations. And they were a mean to stimulate, to facilitate access for funding to SMEs, so to small companies, and social entrepreneurs. From one side, the idea was to facilitate investing in these companies, and on the other side, to help funds, venture capital funds and social funds to achieve a critical size so that they could make a difference when investing in these companies. The main target of the two regulations was to create a brand and to have a recognized mean to boost the investment in these companies, while not dumping and not involving investor protection. I'll give a quick background of the EU legal frameworks for asset management. This is very, let's say, at the general level, and this is before the review. So in EU, we have the EuSEF's framework, which is the frameworks for undertakings for collective investments in transferable securities. This is what usually is referred to as, as mutual funds. And we are quite simple as a, let's say, setup, because everything which is not an EuSEF's is by definition an alternative investment fund, so an AIF. And all the AIF are regulated under the Alternative Investment Fund Managers Directive, the AFMD, which set up the requirements for the managers of the fund, while the funds are left at the discretion of the member states. The AFMD, let's say, kicks in at the threshold of 500 million of asset under management for the manager. That was why in 2013 there was let's say, need to create two specialized framework for venture capital funds and for social entrepreneurship funds to address the needs of those managers managing, let's say, less assets, but more focused on venture capital. The idea was that those managers may not be required to fulfill the whole requirements in the FMD, which may be seen as burdensome sometimes, but they could have, let's say, more favorable framework. Just to complete the picture, I put here also LTIF, which is the European Long-Term Investment Funds Regulation, and the Money Market Funds Regulation. So just to go back to the main features of the two regulations, the main one was to give access to an EU-wide passport. As I was mentioning, smaller managers do not have the benefit of having the EU-wide passport, meaning that they cannot market their funds across the EU. The EuVECA and EuSEF regulation, nevertheless, having uniform rules for these funds, gave the marketing passport to those managers. They gave this benefit given that the manager had to respect some rules. In particular, they had to invest at least 70% of their capital in qualifying investments. But at the same time, they gave to the managers flexibility on how they can invest in these assets. At the same time, they had limits on borrowing and leverage, and they were meant initially for professional investors, but also for non-professional investors with some constraints. As I was saying before, the two regulations came into force in 2013. But in 2015, there were a kind of initial assessment of these regulations, and we found out that the take-up were below the initial expectations. So we found out that there were less managers than expected using these funds, that the number of funds which were set up was not as expected. And so we decided to, let's say, anticipate the review of the two regulations. And starting with the public consultations, the Commission decided to have an impact assessment to study in deep all possible changes and to propose amendments to the regulations. So the impact assessment focused mainly on four items. The first one was the limitation in the original regulations on larger asset managers. The second one was on the eligible assets, so the definition of the investment targets these funds could invest into. The third one was more related to the, let's say, operations and the costs to set up the funds and to market the funds across Europe. And the fourth item was related to the minimum investments for non-professional investors. So the result of our impact assessment and of the negotiations that follow with the Council and Parliament were that the new regulation now allows also large manager, the manager authorized under the AFMD, to manage and market EuSEF and EuVECA funds. The idea is that larger managers who have established brands and larger, let's say, volumes should help in creating economies of scales, and also should help in getting the brands more known, thus increasing the take-up of the funds. The second change related to the eligible assets. So there was an expansion of the eligible assets both in EuVECA and EuSEF, so that there are more targeted companies that can benefit from these funds. And in the case of EuSEF, it was also linked to the fact that these funds can now better be seen as vehicle for financing from EU programs managed by the European investment funds. The third change related to the costs. So there was a clarification on the level of own funds to be put by the managers to set up the funds. There was a simplification in the procedure and costs for the cross-border marketing of the funds. And there was a first, let's say, move to give a stronger role for ESMA, which is the Securities and Markets Authority, in having a more, let's say, overarching role in the supervisory convergence of these funds. The last item, which was addressed in the impact assessment, which the Commission did not propose to change, and also then the co-legislator did not want to change, was the minimum investment of 100,000 euro for non-professional investors. There were some, let's say, requests and some reasons why stakeholders asked to reduce this minimum investment, but the trade-off of reducing the investment and maintain the adequate retail investor protection measures would have ultimately become more burdensome for the managers who had to comply with more rules to run these funds. I would stop here as a first overview, and then maybe we can go more in details later on with your questions.
Indeed. Thank you, Giovanni, for this very clear and also comprehensive overview. Now we're gonna dive even more into the topic, and we'll explore together also some legal technicalities of the EuSEF regulation with our next speaker, Mr. Roberto Randazzo, who, as I said, is a lawyer with specific skills in and expertise in social entrepreneurship. He will also, during his presentation, explore a case study. Please, Roberto, welcome. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Matteo. Thanks to EVPA for this invitation. I'm very happy to participate today. This is my first speech as a president-elect of EuSELA, the European Social Enterprise Law Association, which is an association of lawyers, practitioners, and scholars involved in this field. The topic of today, it's quite relevant in order to develop and attract investments into the social enterprise sector. My overview will be more technical than the Giovanni introduction, and I would like to develop through a case which are the issues that a lawyer has to face in order to support a EuSEF fund, and which are the suggestions coming from the field for the regulator. I would like to introduce very briefly, because Giovanni did before than me, the EuVECA and EuSEF regulation. The family is the Alternative Investment Fund, and this family represents a different approach from the EU to a way to develop and attract investments in a specific sector of European economy that need to be supported in order to grow up. Let me say, is the case of the small and medium enterprises, for instance, and this is the case for social enterprises. Moving to the requirements, the main are related to the topic that Giovanni exposed before. I would like to focus on the qualified investments, so the target that EuVEC and EuSEF fund could reach through their activities. And also because this is a part of the new approach that we received quite 2 months ago from the EU about the wider perspective and wider framework in order to invest in these fields. About EuVECA, the first one, the first limit, it is about not listed company. So we are talking about small and medium enterprises, not listed, with less than 250 employees. This is something that's changed through the new regulation, and with a turnover lower than 50 million. And this is another element that has been changed by the new law. The field could not be, the sector could not be about banking, finance, and insurance activities. About EuSEF, the targets are defined as entities aiming at reaching positive social impact, which is something not strictly defined under a legal point of view, but this is, let me say, the milestone in order to understand better how and which is this field, this social entrepreneurship field. And the way to understand how a positive social impact could be run by these legal entities, it is the measurement, the measurability of the activity run by these legal entities. This is something that I would like to exploit later on. Moving to the review of regulation that we just received, we have to point out that, and Giovanni did before than me, that if something did not went in the right way, was the approach to this field by fund managers, because just 34 EuVECA funds and just 6, now 7, if I'm not wrong, EuSEF funds are running their activity under the EU member states. And this is not a success story to tell, but this is, let me say, a seed. And this seed attracted the evaluations from the EU Commission in order to scale up the law. And when we received the amending regulation, I do not go through the point that Giovanni exploited before than me. This amending regulation was in order to grow up these funds, but also in order to grow up the possible targets in order to run EuVECA and EuSEF investments. The main and the relevant point is not in this slide, but I anticipated it because I will discuss about it later, evaluating the case. It is about the extension of qualified investments. This is peculiar because my personal opinion is that the Commission understood that a way to support the growth of the system was to include different legal entities that at the first round of this regulation were not included. Let me say that the main relevant point for EuVECA, it is represented by companies, or let me say legal entities, in order to include all the different legal structure that target could achieve in different jurisdictions. I mean, legal entities that could be also listed in small and medium enterprises stock market, the one that were set up to provided by MiFID II in order to grow up the small medium enterprises system. This is something relevant because it substitutes the previous regulation, the one about the turnover lower than 50 millions, and extended in this way the EuVECA framework in order to define targets. Just a little bit more tricky is the evaluation of the new approach drafted by the regulatory about EuSEF, because in this case the change, it is related to a smaller definition than the original one about legal entities running services or activities produced in order to achieve a social return. The previous law was about the same activities, but run just in order to reach a benefit for disadvantaged or excluded people. As you can understand, this is a relevant point in order to have a wider framework of possible targets. About market opportunity, the next slide, it is about the sectors under an SRI approach. So it's really general. It is just to understand which could be the fields, the sector attractive for EuSEF fund. And as you can understand, this is something to be metabolized and evaluated jurisdiction by jurisdiction. This is the main problem, because we do not have a general overview about sectors, better activities that could be run by targets, but it is a general approach to this sector. In any case, starting from this approach, and this means starting from the sector pointed out in this slide, we will evaluate activity by activity which could be the target for the EuSEF fund. Came to the case study. This is something that's this is a transaction that I assisted here in Italy. An asset management company set up in Italy in order to achieve the goal to be recognized as a EuSEF fund. This was the origin, sorry, the approach to this project. For that reason, I used the EuSEF definition, EuSEF label in this slide, but this is the point that I would like to discuss together with you. Because the original project was to set up a EuSEF fund in order to support and invest into the legal entities running those activities pointed out by the EU regulation. The problem was that during the procedure in front of Bank of Italy, accordingly to the EU regulations, the client in this case pointed out a few problems coming from the local jurisdiction. I mean that this was the case, Italy was the case, in order to create an overlap between the EU law and the local law that's instead of increasing the framework to run investments, I mean targets, created the opposite results. Because overlapping the EU regulatory framework to the Italian framework about social enterprises, the problem was that there were not enough legal entities, according to the Italian law, able to run sustainable activities in order to be attractive for an investor, for a fund. This was something that came obviously from the local jurisdiction, but this is a relevant point in order to discuss during our conclusion, which could be the next step about the EU regulation. Because this is not a problem just for Italy, it's a problem also for other jurisdictions. The second one was the point that I pointed out before, because before the recent change that we receive in the EU regulation, the legal entities considered as qualified investments were too qualified in some way. I mean, that provision related to running activities and services with a social results, but related to disadvantage and excluded people, was a lens through which was very difficult to look at the market, or better, was possible, but a very close number of legal entities considered eligible for these investments. Moving to targets, and the next slide represents the whole scenario, and this comes from the EVPA definition of the investable spectrum in this field. Let me say that the area in which a EuSEF fund can act is the one related to the central definitions, the one under impact first approach. Obviously, this could change from case to case and from approach to approach of investment funds, but the area is quite well defined by this this slide. I think that some of the attendants, as being a practitioner, knows quite well the process to run an investment, but in order to have a complete framework, I think that it is necessary to have, through the next slide, the approach to the market run by an investor. The tricky point, I think, today, it is scouting activity. I think by, according to my experience, better to my client experience, specifically in our jurisdiction, the problem today it is to find out relevant targets. I mean, target ready to receive equity investments through the use of regulation. This is something that comes from the market. This is something that is going to change, but is changing really fast. But it's something that has been faced by the pioneer that started to act in this field a few years ago. The problem it is to create a pipeline of investments able enough to attract investment for this EuSEF fund. And this is connected to the screening. Today, most of the businesses related to this sector comes through incubator activities or business accelerator activities, specifically in those sectors where technology overlaps social needs. About due diligence, nothing so relevant. It's something that you have to run in order to understand if your target is really eligible for the investments. And coming to the investments and the approval, this is a way that could change from fund to fund, but this is something that we have to relate to the regulatory framework and to the rules that the fund set up at the beginning. It's relevant to understand since the beginning, which is the pipeline of investments, the sector, but also the governance and the decision to be taken by the fund. The last point about exit, and probably this is the most tricky point of the whole system. Let me say the whole impact investments, in this case EuSEF investment system, because today we do not have any track record about the exits in this sector. This is something that creates problems under a legal point of view because of the exit strategy is not the same that we can have in the private equity sector. I mean, at least at the moment, most of the transactions are related to a workers' buyout exit strategy. But I mean, this is something that will be exploited in next years in order to have a complete scenario and in order to evaluate how to generate different exit strategies than workers buyout. About investment instruments, these the last slides sum up the ways that an investment could be run for a EuSEF fund. This is the regulatory framework, but it is also the solutions that the case study took, and it overlaps equity or quasi-equity instruments with loan instruments. The main information that we have to share it is that the fund will have to invest at least 70% in the qualifying instruments, and this is relevant because it defines the role of the fund and the target that he has to set up. And about investments, the equity investments could be run directly into the qualified targets, so the fund become shareholders of the target, of the qualified targets. It is possible to exchange equity instruments. You have to think to different shares of different category, for instance. So if the target decide to issue a different category of shares, you can exchange as an investor A to B shares, for instance. And it is possible also to run loans. But in this case, the regulatory framework is quite strict because the loan could be issued just to an invested target, so a qualified invested target. And these loans, the total amount of loans cannot exceed the 30% of the total investment of the fund. As a conclusion, let me anticipate something that probably will be discussed later on. I used the EuSEF definition in order to discuss my case, and this was because of this case moved from EuSEF to EuVECA regulation. One of the reasons was to have a wider range of targets to be invested, but the case that I introduced to you was quite hybrid, because moving from EuSEF to EuVECA and being approved as a EuVECA fund, this fund decided to adopt an impact measurement solution in order to demonstrate that all the target invested would be also invested as a EuSEF fund. In other words, the project of this fund, it is to demonstrate that also EuVECA legal entities under the regulatory definition could run social activities and could be measured positively under a social impact point of view as a EuSEF legal entity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Roberto, for this detailed explanation and for giving us a concrete example we can reflect upon. Our next speaker will give us even more insights based on his direct experience of a manager of one of the few EuSEF funds in Europe. He will tell us all the challenges he encountered while obtaining the EuSEF designation and all opportunities the designation might give to investors and social enterprises. I welcome Mr. De Guerre. Please, Mr. Olivier De Guerre, the floor is yours.
Yes, good afternoon. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to explain what we've done in FiTrust in the last 10 years. First, just to present FiTrust, we are an asset manager in France. We run today roughly 100 million euros. 50 million euros are under EuSEF's, classical equity funds where we do shareholder engagement to promote ESG practices within very large corporates in Europe. And we have 50 million in private equity fund. 15 million of that 1.5 are in classical private equity for innovation, but for impact, social and environmental impact. So with AIMF regulation, classical regulation, and 35 million of it within EuSEF regulation on FiTrust Partenaires. I will explain more in detail. We have structured FiTrust Partenaires 10 years ago, before the EuSEF regulation, because our foundation found social enterprises that were looking for funding. And there was no way at that time to do that by a fund or whatever. So we structured a classical investment company without any regulation, which was directly devoted to fund social enterprises in France and in Europe. So our positioning is we invest in, as a minor shareholder, in SMEs that have a very strong social and environmental impact, and that is measurable, which is very important. I will talk afterwards. We support those companies trying to accelerate them, and we use our network and experience, and we have a very peculiar organization, which is important in the EuSEF regulation also, is that we are an investment company and we have an investment committee with shareholders, and they decide the investment and they go in the project to mentor and support the entrepreneur to help him grow. So it's a bit different from a classical, I would say, private equity asset management. And we want those to scale, and we have invested in different countries. I will take later. Next slide, please. Today we have 20 to 25 investment. Roughly it's 200K to 800, but more 1 million K today. We have 4 targeted sectors, which are mainly technology, microfinance, access to employment, and social housing. We have been in France, in Belgium, Germany, Italy, Spain. We also very few in Africa, but 92% of our portfolio is in Europe. We have a mixed equity debt, which is very important with the EuSEF regulation, because to do debt through EuSEF regulation, we have to use a convertible bond, but we can discuss that later, because it's not possible to make loans to those companies. And we cannot also make just equity, because if we do just equity as a small company, we will take 50, 60, 70% of the share of capital, which is absolutely not the objective. And we measure impact, which is the main issue, in order to say, project by project with the entrepreneur, we measure the impact, what he's looking for in social, environmental objectives. And it's not for a tool for measurement, it's a tool for strategical development to help him to go exactly where he wants, because we want to be invested in social enterprises. Next slide. So we have today on the right the foundation, which is an endowment fund, which is supporting not-for-profit organization with grant and technical support. We have FITRUS Partenaires, which is the first company created 10 years ago, which is now 15 million euros. We will be 20 million this year. It's in Europe, mainly European Union, because it's 85%, 90% of the investment. And we've made some very small investment in Switzerland, Africa, Asia, because social innovation, there is no frontier today, and there is very, very interesting projects that we can bring back to EU afterwards. We have a specific label, French, which is a solidarity label, or solidaire, and we have 1/3 of our companies which have this label, which is a little more strict than the EU definition of social enterprises. And 2/3 of our social enterprises are defined by the European legislation. A specific point on this, which is important, is that the EU social definition is very interesting. The GECES has worked a lot to define it, but we have discovered, it's a very strange thing, that in different departments in Brussels, they could have different ideas of social enterprises. So I think there could be an interesting work to be done to be sure that there is one definition in the EU for, I would say, what is a social enterprises. We have structured 2 years ago with the European Investment Fund, a sub-compartment which is called FITRUS Partenaires Europe, but it's the same investment committee, so it's the same strategy, which is 20 million euros, and which is dedicated 100% to EU, and which is 100% in social enterprises. And it's going to be also EuSEF. It's just small point that we have to see with regulatory in France, the AMF, but it's going to be EuSEF because it's exactly the same organization and the same strategy. Next slide, please. So, why choosing EuSEF? I think I've tried to precise 3 things. First, legislation. AIFM directive is inappropriate for small private equity funds, and much more for small private equity funds that want to fund social enterprises. Second, selling fund in the EU is not possible if you do not have an agreement. Some do it, but it's not official, and we wanted to have it on an official way. Third, very large institutions today cannot invest in funds which are not regulated. And if you have a social investment fund, if you do not have a EuSEF regulation, they will not invest. And then there is a custodian, which is a very strong issue. When you have a small fund, a few million euros, if you have to have a custodian, it costs a lot. And a lot of they do not have, I would say, the system and the organization to run small funds like could be those funds. So we do not have custodian, and it's not an issue. And I can answer question after why. Our strategy is to invest in social enterprises in France and in the EU. So on the right, the definition of social enterprises is very good one. It's larger than the French one, and we use it in most of our investments. Second, impact is a key driver for the strategy. The financial return is a mean, it's not the objective. Impact measurement reporting is an obligation for EuSEF managers. And for us, it was a very, very good thing that we have regulatory framework where we can say that we have to bring impact measurement. What is very interesting is that in France we have a certain number of funds that are doing the same thing than us, that are not EuSEF, are not regulated anyway, because the French regulatory AMF considers that as they have a social objective and not a financial objective, they do not have to be whatever regulation is it, AIFM, UCITS, whatever. We choose to be EuSEF because we think it's very important to develop shows. Third thing, it's possible with EuSEF to have self-regulated fund, which is not possible in other regulation. And we have a self-regulated fund because it's our it's not the asset management where I am, we decide the investment, it's the investment committee with some of the investors. So it was very important to have the capacity to have those to intervene. And if we have today a very strong portfolio with very few losses and with very, very good companies, it's mainly because we have those mentors that decide the investment and that support those entrepreneurs. So it's a very important tool for us. Last thing for strategy, investors are invited to participate. And so it's the thing we think. And what will also be useful, because at the beginning we were small and we were 3-4 million a few years ago in capacity. If we had to pay a custodian, we would not have done that. So I think it's a very interesting thing. Next slide. So today we have a label which is a Finansol, which is a French label. We have a label Entreprise Solidaire with a French specific social label, and we have EuSEF. And we do believe that the most interesting and the most important for us is the EuSEF label, and we deeply regret that there is not so many funds like us today. But maybe I will explain in conclusion my opinion on this. Next slide. Regulation with the regulator. At first, the discussion with the regulator in France has been very long and difficult. We didn't take any lawyer because we are an asset manager, so we know very well the AMF. And it has been lucky not to do that because it took us 2 years or 1.5. But just because the AMF did not know the regulation. So I think the first thing is that as there is very few EuSEF, they do not know how to deal with that. Second, reporting to regulator for EuSEF is light and in line with expectation. Much lighter than the AIFM that we have in the other private equity funds, and much more in line with what we do in the type of portfolio we have as a company we have. So we're very happy to that, and we very often discuss impact measurement with our regulator, which I think is a very important thing to bring the fact that there is not only risk or financial performance, there is also impact measurement and impact way of evaluating the performance there is in terms of impact, which is very important. And they are very open to discussion. And each time we've got an issue, we discuss with them, we call them, and today they are really, really very open. So I think it's very important. When they know, they like it, and they want to push it. Next. The label with EuSEF is not known. And after explanation, many investors prefer this regulation to no regulation. We have very large investors that came to us, that invested small amounts with us, 2-3 million, so it's small amounts, it's not very big amounts. But if we were not EuSEF, even it's a French institution, they would not have done it. So I think it's very important for large institutions. Second, in other countries, they were very happy to know that we could sell in their country the product and that it was regulated. We have investors in UK, Belgium, for example, and discussion in Belgium with intermediaries and banks to propose the product to their clients has been very useful. One point, which is very strange, in France, in the EU, the minimum is 100K. In Belgium, the banks we work with decided it was 250K and not 100 because it was in line with other requirements in Belgium. Investors like that this label, EuSEF, ensures that we will keep on this social strategy and that we will give impact measurement reporting. Because we will have lower returns than classical private equity, they have to be sure that we can bring them the reason why they come with for it, which is social impact. And then private equity teams, they had private equity investment had a lot of difficulties to accept self-regulated funds, but after long explanations to EIF, for example, they validated the process. Next slide. In conclusion, I would say three things. First, I understand why the EU didn't want to go under 100K, but I think it's an issue because we have, for example, in France, but also in other countries, many small funds where you have very small investors that want to invest in social funds. I would suggest that I tried to do it, but no success last year in Brussels. In France, we've got a regulation 90-10 where you can have classical UCITS that can have up to 10% of their exposure in solidaire, in social funds. I think it would be a good way to bring small investors in this type of investment with a risk which is low because it will be less than 10% of their exposure, and it will allow to have the actual regulation on EuSEF. Second, I think there is a question which is important on definition of EU social enterprises to be sure that it's the same in all EU organizations. And I've been very puzzled because for European investment funds that have invested today in 8 to 10 social investment funds in the EU, just 2 are EuSEF. So I do not understand why the EU have a regulation dedicated to EuSEF, to European social enterprises, and that when there is a facility to fund those funds, most of them are not EuSEF. And in conclusion, I think it's a very interesting tool. It brings a lot of opportunity within in private investors, large organizations, large institutions, to go in other countries to find investors. So we're very happy to be a EuSEF regulated. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Olivier Deguerre, for sharing your direct experience, for your examples. Thank you also to all the panelists for their detailed and clear presentation. It's now time for a question and answer session, so I invite the audience to write the question in the panel if they want. But before opening the floor to the audience, I also would like to ask some question to the panelists. And my first question goes to our first speaker, Mr. Giovanni Garcia. Giovanni explained the use of reform and also, give us the overview of this regulation. My question for Giovanni is, before the reform, only 7 funds registered with EuSEF. Why do you think very few fund managers took advantage of this tool? What were, in your opinion, the weaknesses of the regulation? And if you think the reform actually improved the previous situation, and if so, how?
Okay, thank you for your question. Well, of course, I hope that the recent reforms, the changes that have been introduced will help to make the framework more, let's say, known and more successful. Maybe one of the reason was historically, let's say, because after the crisis, there was the AFMD, so the directive for alternative investment funds. And following the crisis, it was, let's say, focused on financial stability, ensuring investor protection. And it was a very, let's say, long debate, a huge work with many different point of views. And so member state and parliament had, say, to come to an agreement. The rules were new. And so when EuVECA and EuSEF came into the picture, which was only 2 years after, they had to, let's say, take a niche place. So they've been, let's say, dedicated only to, say, really focused venture capital and social entrepreneurship. They've been granted some exemptions, some relaxed rules. So for instance, as Mr. Deguerre was saying, they had the passport, but had not to have a depository bank. and so their, let's say, scope was somehow constrained a bit. So I think that now with, let's say, allowing also larger managers to run these funds and having widen the assets these funds can invest into, I think it will have a broader, let's say, impact, both in terms of number of funds coming to the market and also in, let's say, funding available to the social enterprises.
Thank you, Giovanni. I mean, I actually have another question for you, because I mean, you explain why there were these weaknesses in the past, and I mean, you explain very clearly the context. But I mean, I want to link like the second question to what Mr. Deguerre said. Mr. Deguerre said at the end of this presentation that actually EuSEF is a very successful and also is a very useful tool. And perhaps one of the problems is that actually is not very well promoted, advertised. Are you thinking about something, the Commission, in order to better advertise this tool that actually can be very useful for both fund managers and social enterprises?
I mean, unfortunately, it's not the role of the Commission to, let's say, promote, let's say, legal frameworks or, let's say, how private players should run their businesses. Of course, this is a voluntary framework, so managers have to choose what they want to do. What we think the best way to promote it is allow also larger managers to run these funds. So we think that if all, let's say, the big players will also now start setting up these funds, start marketing these funds, and start investing, we think that could be the best and, let's say, easier way to get the brand more known and to get it more powerful across Europe.
That can be, indeed, can be like a practical and also smart strategies to promote this this very useful tool. I have another question.
Can I, excuse me, can I intervene? Just
please, absolutely.
When we discussed with the European Investment Fund that they could invest in our strategy, they didn't ask us to be EuSEF. It's because we told them that we were EuSEF, they say, you could become EuSEF. So I think one thing that could be done is that when the EU makes a facility to fund social teams that are going to fund social enterprises in the EU, they tell them you should use EuSEF regulation. Second, there is two very important elements. It's very important to allow very large asset managers to develop EuSEF. Of course, it's a good thing to have, and it should help to get EuSEF. But managers will launch EuSEF just when they're going to look for EU investors in other countries. If you launch a fund just in your own country, today you're not obliged to be EuSEF. You can use other ways. So I think it's mainly dedicated to those investors, those asset managers who want to raise funds all across Europe. That's the first thing. And second, if you look at very, I would say, social teams or teams that are managing social investment products in the EU today, small team we meet in Italy, in Spain, in France, in Portugal, whatever. They are very small and they do not know very well regulation. So as they do not know very well regulation, they don't know very easily to EuSEF because very few people know EuSEF regulation.
Thank you, Mr. Deguerre, for chipping in and sharing with us your opinion. I actually have a question for you, Mr. Deguerre, that was sent to us by Miss Elizabeth Pedersen, and she asked actually a question directly to you. And the question is, can you please explain what EuSEF annual reporting entails and the cost? Is a question for you, Mr. Deguerre. Yeah.
Yes, the cost of EuSEF is low because either you're a classical fund and you ask for EuSEF, or you're a holding company and you ask for EuSEF. So if you are a classical fund, it will be the same cost that you have in your fund. And if you have a holding company or an investment company, the costs are going to be low. So normally you shouldn't have more costs because you're EuSEF than what you would have classically. In terms of reporting, what is asked is that we have to publish to our shareholders or the people that are investors annually a report on obviously the financial report on the fund, but also a report on impact that we do. So we have developed a methodology, but you have many methodologies existing in the market today where you can bring to your investors impact measurement on an annual basis to explain, I've put 100, in 2018, and in 2020 or 23 or 25, there would be, creation of jobs, homeless, put back to work, whatever, and showing the impact you have. And it's not a cost in reality, because in fact, it's a tool that we use for strategical mentoring and support of the project we support. So the cost is very low. And in terms of, I would say, lawyer, we have a lawyer that we use, but it's not it doesn't cost more than classical funds.
Thank you, Mr. Olivier, for answering this question. You were in your answer. You were mentioning, the importance of having a lawyer, and we are very lucky today because in our panel discussion we actually do have a lawyer. It's actually our second speaker, Roberto, and I have a question for you, Roberto. The question is: imagine a fund wants to register via EuSEF. What would be your concrete advice? Can you hear me, Roberto?
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Coming back to the case, my advice is related to what happened here, assisting this asset manager in order to receive the EuSEF label. The first suggestion it is to check targets in your own jurisdiction in order to evaluate and understand if the local law it overlaps with the regulatory framework. This is something that came out here in Italy, but I anticipated it during my speech, because sometimes the framework it is not perfectly aligned with the EU regulatory framework. Just to give you an example, the eligible qualified investments here in Italy under the EuSEF originary provisions were not enough strong in order to face the sustainable business, and in order to be invested, because the problem was that social enterprises in Italy were not able to distribute profit, for instance, because of the law. So as you can understand, this means that your target locally is not the same provided by the EU regulatory framework. The second one, it is about cost, because I do agree with Olivier about his approach to cost. No differences between EuSEF fund and others, just to sum up. The problem is that the procedure in front of the local bank, for us, Bank of Italy, it's at the end of the day, it's quite similar to every other fund to be regulated locally. This means that it's quite long and costs for consultancy activities, for instance. So it is something to be evaluated very well at the beginning, and it is to be compared to the capacity to be funded, so to run a fundraising campaign in order to run the fund activity. And a suggestion connected to this, it is evaluate the possibility to create a common legal entity under the EuSEF label in order to create a sort of platform in order to connect different initiatives. I mean, this is something that could be considered as helpful in order to support those initiatives that are not enough strong to run a fundraising campaign, able to raise enough money to make lower the cost that you have to afford. So this possibility is something that I'm personally going to evaluate in next weeks for 2 different clients, and this is something that I suggest could be a very strong solution in order to collect different initiatives.
Thank you, Roberto, for your answer. I think it's important for the audience to get also these tips. I mean, from a lawyer who has experience on this topic. While you were speaking, I actually have received another question from Jimmy Alvarez, and this question is directed to Giovanni. And the question is the following, Giovanni. Most of impact funds are too small and cannot afford the cost and the time to get national regulators to understand and decide quickly on the process to become an EuSEF. Countries where pioneers like Fee Trust have already gone through the process are ready, but other countries too costly. Could there be a plan to help national regulators to understand and apply EuSEF of subsidized pioneers that decide to start the process in a country for the first time? It's a long question, but
that's a very interesting question. I mean, I think what you are referring to is what Mr. De Geer experienced himself. I mean, when the regulation came into force for the first time, they were something new for everybody. It took a while to understand exactly how a national regulator should deal with that. Some member states did it faster, others took a bit longer. What I can say from our side is that with the review, at least since last year, all member states became more aware of these regulations, and so there should be a bit more, let's say, knowledge about that. Practically, you could let us know, or you could ask your regulator to basically deal and ask how other regulators did it. The usual platform where these exchanges between regulators are done is within ESMA, which is the European Securities and Market Authorities.
Thank you, Giovanni, for answering this question. I have another question for you, Olivier. I mean, I would like to take advantage of your practical experience. As we were saying, you're one of the few EuSEF funds currently in place. So, I mean, do you have any anecdotes, concrete example of lesson learned that you have gained through your experience and you would like to share with our audience? Some very concrete tips. Thanks.
Concrete thing, but there is absolutely no. It may be that I would say, how would I say that? Maybe what we have, it would be different in other countries or with other people. First, we began first with a lawyer to go and discuss with the regulator. It was much more complicated, so we decided to do it directly ourselves, and it was much easier. For a simple reason is that we had to explain to the lawyer what was the EuSEF regulation. So by chance today, there is more lawyers that know it. And I think the proposal that Roberto said that would be a sort of platform for all Europe in order to regulate on an easier way, I think it would be a very, very good thing to help those who do not know and and we have to understand the issue. The first meeting we had in AMF regulator and the last meeting where we had the agreement, we had 8 different people in charge, and each time we had to re-explain 100% of the regulation. So it took us more than 1.5 years. So that's a concrete example of the issue we had. Second concrete example is that it's sometimes a little strange. EuSEF, you can invest in EU social enterprises or countries that are candidate to the EU. That means that you cannot invest in a Swiss social enterprise, but you can invest in a Turkey social enterprise, which is in Turkey. It can be a little strange, so from time to time we find that the strict application to EU for investment, it's so. Third thing which is very interesting is that we very often, as has been said in previous presentation, we had projects that have a part for profit and a part not for profit. And very often we have discussion of is it a social enterprise or not, or can we invest in, or should not we invest because it will not be sustainable. So the question that Roberto raised are clearly the question we have also in France and or in other countries. But we always find ways by organizing differently those organizations to find a way to invest in not-for-profit organization that becomes for-profit and with which we can make them invest, etc. So we have to do some financial engineering in order to be able to invest in those organizations that at first it is impossible to invest.
Thank you, Olivier. I think again, I think for this kind of topic and considering the audience that is joining the webinar today, I think it's very important to share your practical experience on this topic. I received another question from Elizabeth Pedersen that I would like to ask to everybody. So feel free to reply. Do any of the speakers have clarity on how social impact will be interpreted under the revised regulation? Is it enough if for a profit company commits to sustainability? How concrete must the social impact be? Who would like to reply to this question? Maybe Roberto?
Because the approach that the case I introduced before was to mix the two solution EuVECA and EuSEF, because the question remind me the solution that this asset manager decided to take. The problem was that the risk under the EuSEF regulation was to get a too strict framework of legal entities reconnected to social enterprises. Social enterprises have to be evaluated jurisdiction by jurisdiction. So this means that you have to check if your jurisdiction is enough wide and open to consider your target as an investable, not under the legal point of view, but under a business point of view, an investable asset. The problem is the overlap of the two laws, the local jurisdiction and the EU regulatory framework. For that reason, if you move to the EuVECA solution and the targets that you would like to consider are profits, legal entities running profit businesses, today also listed in a SME stock exchange market under the new legal framework. But you can decide, and this is not mandatory from the law, but you can decide to take the Article 10 from the EuSEF regulatory framework in order to draft your own social impact measurement tool. In this way, you can evaluate if the social impact generated by your targets under the EUECA and not EuSEF law should be considered as social. So this could be a very holistic solution and approach in order to have a mix of the two. And this is also my suggestion to the EU Commission in order to evaluate if, as a next step, probably it's too early to suggest the next step because we just received the new and updated law. But as a next step, in order to mix the two EUECA and EuSEF funds rules, in order to make a wider window to invest in this field.
Thank you, Roberto, for your answer.
I will have a different view.
Please, Olivier.
There is a very clear definition in the EuSEF for what's a social enterprise, and the GECES with experts from all over Europe has worked at least 2 years to define what should be a social enterprise and can you define it and how. And I think the work that has been done is very good because it makes a real difference between, I would say, a classical investment where you have an impact because there is creation of jobs, from an investment in a company that wants to create jobs. And its first objective is to create jobs. And I think it's very important to have a specific would say framework for that, because today we have in worldwide in France, Europe, and in the US, everyone talk of impact investing. And we find so many differences between what is really social impact investing from, I would say, impact investing, that I really believe that we have to have a specific framework, and we have the chance to have a specific framework that define exactly what's social impact investing, so that the investors, the private investors, the institution, know exactly in which type of products invest. Because today it's very difficult when you go to whatever organization for an impact investment. You have so different products that you really do not know in which product you invest.
Thank you, Olivier. I think since the both of you replied, and since Roberto also mentioned the European Commission, I think it's also correct to give the floor to Giovanni, who maybe would also comment to this question.
I mean, just to complement, I agree with what you said. There is also in the regulation itself, it's pretty well defined which kind of companies or which kind of entities can be the target of the EuSEF fund, when it says exactly that this undertaking shall have the achievement of measurable positive social impacts as the primary objective. So I think it's pretty clear there.
Thank you, Giovanni, for the clarification. If I'm not mistaken, it's Article 2, like we were reading, right? Yeah. Okay. So I have the last question for you, Giovanni. Again, this question was asked by Dario Vince, and the question is the following: EuSEF does not allow leverage, meaning the EuSEF funds cannot borrow. How this works in practice? There are two issues here that needs to be explained. An ideal scenario for an impact fund is to attract both equity and debts from LPs. So this part of the regulation under bracket cuts that source of funding self-managed funds needs to borrow to cover costs. And the other one is the regulation allows leveraging up to the level of capital commitments. How this work in practice?
Yes, thank you for the question. I mean, as it's already in the question, it's not entirely true that EuSEF cannot borrow. The main reason they cannot be leveraged is that the idea is that these funds do invest in social enterprises, and they do not have a speculative, let's say, purpose. They are not pursuing some strategy like private equity, leverage buyout, or some other strategy which involve use of leverage. At the same time, we understand the strategy of these funds do not require the investors to put, let's say, all the money on day zero, but they just do commitment of their capital contribution. So in this respect, to bridge the gap from when, let's say, the investor committed the money and when the fund manager identify an investment target and decide to invest, and when the investor then paid in, there is the possibility for the fund to borrow for a temporary basis.
Thank you, Giovanni, for answering also this question. I have a final question for all our panelists. This, I mean, it's an open question. I guess there is not a right or wrong answer, but I think it can be interesting for the audience to understand your opinion about it. And the last question I would like to ask to all of you is, what is your prediction about the EuSEF recent reform? I understand it's a difficult question because, as we said in the introduction, the reform came into force on the 1st of March. So it's difficult to say if it's going to be successful or not. But I mean, a very brief comment to conclude this very fruitful panel about your prediction. Giovanni, perhaps you want to start?
Well, I mean, we don't have target numbers or any specific, let's say, volume of financing. That's our prediction for the EuSEF to call it a success or not. What we see for the time being is that it's getting more and more known, the framework. People are talking more and more. Also, this webinar shows that there is some interest and there is growing interest. So we hope that it will grow much more in the near future.
Roberto, any remarks? What is your prediction?
We can't
hear you. Okay, there are maybe some technical problems. I'm going to ask this question to Olivier. Olivier, do you have what is your prediction about the reform?
I would be very happy if we had many new EuSEF funds in Europe in the next years. I'm afraid that probably will not be the case because today it's reserved to high wealthy investors, more than 100,000, so it's very few investors in Europe. And it's very large institutions. They may look for maybe other type of products. So I think the best thing would be to open to, I would say, small investors, either directly or to accept that through UCITS, whatever, a small part of them could invest in EuSEF, because otherwise we will not have a large development of EuSEF in the near future.
Thank you, Olivier. I think we have solved our technical issues. Roberto, what is your prediction about the EuSEF recent reform?
I do agree with Olivier. I mean, my thoughts is the same. And let me add that probably this the wider spectrum of qualified investments represents a boost in order to develop the use of funds around Europe. So it's something. My personal feeling is very positive about that reform.
Thank you, thank you. I think it's very nice to conclude a webinar like this with a positive note. I think we can say that this was a mission accomplished, because thanks to all our panelists, and I mean, I really thanks all of them. I think it was a very nice panelist because we had the opportunity to hear different perspectives at different angles on the same topic. Mission accomplished, why? Because I think now it's clear what EuSEF is. It's clear what the reform was about. We have gained some technical examples thanks to the case study outlined by Roberto, and also, I mean, we gained also some practical perspectives thanks to the presentation of Olivier. I mean, I think there was an agreement that actually EuSEF is a very useful tool, and in the past perhaps it was not a success story, but hopefully thanks to the reform put in place by the co-legislators, we will have more EuSEF funds, and this will allow more social enterprises to attract more investments across Europe. So thanks again to all the panelists. It was really a pleasure. I would like to remind to everybody to fill in the questionnaire that will pop up at the end of this session. This webinar has been recorded, so it will be available also in the future together to all the other webinars that we have already recorded. It will be available as of next week. If you have any sort of question, you can contact me at the email address you can see on this slide. Thanks again also to all the audience, and we will see for each other for the next webinar that will happen most likely at the end of June. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.